Hello everyone, welcome to The Watch Inquiry, a journalistic look into the watch world, past, present and future, with me, Chris Hall.
And me, Tim Barber. Hello everyone.
And today we are asking, why was 1941 Patek Philippe's greatest year?
And of course, some people might disagree with that. We're kind of asking whether it was Patek Philippe's greatest year, and on that basis, why did something happen which Patek Philippe alone could do? 1941 is the year that Patek Philippe brings out the first serially produced perpetual calendar, and at the same time, the first serially produced perpetual calendar chronograph. And these watches really set the template for Patek Philippe's preeminence in high complication wristwatches and other kicking off point for some of the greatest collector pieces and one of the most extraordinary bloodlines in watch history, which is Patek's run of perpetual calendars and high complications. So, Chris, if I said the numbers to you 1518 and 1526, those ostensibly random digits will, as a watch specialist, have tremendous significance. In the vintage world, these are not just grail watches, they go some way beyond that.
Yeah, when auction houses use that strange convention of calling pretty much everything in a catalogue very rare and important, these Patek references, 1518 and 1526, they really are.
Yeah. They are the first perpetual calendar wristwatches to be made in series. In other words, to be put into serialized production rather than made as unique pieces. And I mean, they're the watches that in some ways set the tone, the template, and the entire platform for Patek Philippe's dominance of the fine watch market.
This is the key thing, isn't it? It was not just the release of two incredible wristwatches in their own right, but the standalone presence of Patek Philippe in the industry in being able to do that.
Yeah, nobody else produced a perpetual calendar wristwatch in series for years. I mean, AP started making perpetual calendars in the 50s, but I mean, it made, I think, 10 or 11, very few. And so it wasn't really until the late 20th century that anything comparable happens. And of course, the references we're talking about, the 1518 perpetual calendar chronograph and the 1526, these watches laid down the template for what we think of both as perpetual calendars, as high complications, that classic look of the chronograph mixed with the perpetual calendar, the collection of the subdials, the moon phase in the middle, that incredible sort of sense of balance and operatic beauty that has become such a calling card, not just of Patek Philippe, but of high watchmaking. So it all starts there. Now, we don't want to rehearse all the dial variants and the near mythical steel editions and what have you, because that's been done plenty of times. But what we do want to do is ask the question, why? Why did these watches emerge at that time? Why did no one else manage anything similar? And to be honest, really even conceive of it? And does all that add up to making 1941 the most important year in Patek Philippe history? And that's a question that's been vexing me a bit, so we decided to have a dive into it.
So you're going to give us a horological, but also a cultural, social, political picture as to what was going on at the time.
Yeah, you can get your PhD at the end of it.
Perfect.
If you stick with us.
Yeah, so that is our inquiry today. And perhaps where we should start is just by describing these two watches, Tim, starting with the 1526, a beautifully economical, elegant perpetual calendar.
Yeah, it is. And I think these designs are so familiar to us today that it's interesting and worthwhile just to think back to when this was really something very, very new and at the absolute cutting edge.
Okay,
so we've got two watches that launch that are crucial to this story in 1941. So the 1526 perpetual calendar, that was the first serially produced perpetual calendar, and it has that very recognizable look. So you've got the window at the top for the day of the week and the month. You've got the moon phase display and that really sort of elegant look that sums up what we think of as a simple perpetual calendar. And it's the basis for modern designs like the 5320 and the 5326, which is the inline perpetual. They all stem from this.
Right.
And so it's the sort of the benchmark in the early days. Then the 1518, this is the big one. This is the watch that if you close your eyes and think of a complicated Patek Philippe wristwatch, and maybe even just think of a complicated Swiss watch, the 1518 is the one that sets the blueprint. So you've got the two chronograph subdials either side, the windows for the day of the week and the month at the top, that wonderful moon phase display sitting within the date display at the bottom, and just this incredible sense of balance, beauty, interest, an awful lot of information. So that emerged in 1941. It was produced until 1955. Production numbers, 281 pieces made in total in those years. And I think for the 1526, you had 210 pieces made over 11 years. And this kind of set its own template. Following that, you had the very, very famous reference 2499, which maybe is in some ways the archetype. If the 1518 starts the lineage, the 2499, which was around for so long, it was around from 1951 to 1985. So that's really for some people, the absolute grail, the most hallowed of these references. And if you want to look up some more of the pieces that come after it in the kind of family tree of important Patek perpetual chronographs, you've got the 3448 that was made until 1981, the 3970, the 5970, today's big behemoth, the 5270. So I don't really want to go into all of those, but I think that this is the starting off point for so much in the way of major league, big time, complicated watchmaking, but it's not something that's necessarily completely inevitable. And one reason for that is that, of course, okay, perpetual calendar, classic pocket watch complication, but it's not necessarily at that time, even an obvious combination to do with a chronograph. It's a bit weird, in fact, to do a chronograph and a perpetual calendar.
Right.
Generally speaking, in pocket watches, you'd see a perpetual calendar combined with a minute repeater, for instance.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
More often than you'd see it combined with a chronograph, because these things, they sort of come from different worlds.
Right, and we think of it as so core to complicated watchmaking precisely because Patek Philippe has made it so over 70, 75 years. But you've already touched on pocket watches and how things were combined, and obviously these are wristwatches and small wristwatches to boot, of the age when a man's wristwatch was 28, 32, 34 at most millimeters.
Yeah, these were 35 millimeters, so at the big end of the scale for that time. But good luck finding a perpetual calendar that size nowadays.
That is no space at all to fit in a lot of watchmaking.
Yes, exactly.
Information on the dial as well.
Yeah, it's tiny by today's standards. We've just had Breitling recently celebrating is it 140 years of Breitling?
I believe so.
And it brought out these 3 perpetual calendar chronographs. So you can trace, in a sense, something like that and what Breitling's doing now back to this watch from Patek in 1941. But of course, those are humongous.
They're about twice
watches.
the size.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So to be able to do that in a time when wristwatches were so small was, not necessarily a sensible thing to take on. And at the same time, the perpetual calendar is, you'd still say, really a sort of a poetic complication, a beautiful, it sort of speaks to posterity, whereas the chronograph is technical, sporty. Utilitarian. Yeah, it's sporty. Right. So these things, it's not obvious that they go together. And of course, it didn't seem to be that obvious to anybody else because there weren't other people trying it.
No one did it. It was daring.
Yeah.
But there are other sort of contextual reasons why this wasn't perhaps front of mind for everyone. Mm-hmm. This is the 1940s we're talking about. Right.
Yeah, exactly. We're at war, of course. We're also in a time, you're coming out of the 1930s, the austerity of the Great Depression, and these things they were expensive. So the 1518, when it came out, 3,000 Swiss francs, which is equivalent to an annual salary for a Swiss banker in 1941. I mean, a year's salary for a banker to go on this. So, bankers were not the target audience, right? We're talking royalty, aristocracy, big time. And we're going to come on to some of that. But of course, the Swiss industry was hit very hard at the start of the 1940s, and so it's very interesting to kind of go, well, Patek was able to not just ride through it, but keep going upwards and cementing its preeminence. So I think where we can kind of start on this is actually going back a decade.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask about whether this was a story about Swiss neutrality, but I think you'll come to that. Right?
Yeah. I think we'll come to that a bit. But the starting off point is what's happened in the 1930s in wristwatches.
Okay.
So we go through the period where the pocket watch gives way to the wristwatch as the predominant form of timekeeping, and the entire nature of what you think a watch can be or should be, and how it's worn and how you think about it changes. So, I mean, just to give a little bit of context to this, Wall Street crash, 1929, had a huge impact in Switzerland. Exports fell from 21 million watches in 1929 to 16 million in 1930 to just over 8 million in 1932. So huge impact. Many companies in huge trouble, including Patek Philippe. But at the same time, you've got this big changeover, so that by 1934, twice as many wristwatches were being exported as pocket watches, and by 1937. Okay, bearing in mind we were at 8 million exports in 1932, by 1937 we're back up to 28 million units being exported. And of course, that's partly because we're now in the wristwatch world and the wristwatches are completely dominant. So we're still before the war, but we've gone through the 1930s as this incredible period of absolute change. And not least, so the 20s, you've got these sort of rather florid designs. People are really interested in unusual case shapes as we move from being pocket watches to something that you can discover on the wrist. But I think this period of austerity, of stripping everything back, it changes the tenor. And the wristwatch is actually a symbol of a break from the past. We're going towards something modern, functional, pared back. You've got steel on the rise as a material for watchmaking. You've got new kinds of lifestyles that need things like, the reverso gets invented for sports watches, waterproof watches. The Oyster Perpetual, of course, is the ultimate all-rounder watch at the time, and Patek brings its reference 96, what we now know as the Calatrava, which is a really sort of much more minimal design.
That comes out in 32, I'm thinking.
That's right.
Yeah.
At the same time, you're seeing them industrializing the ways that these things can be made and can be decorative. There's a really interesting section in Alex Barter's book, The Watch, about this and how these things are changing. And he draws attention to this fact that, it's not just the designs that are changing, it's the way these designs are executed. It's the possibility that these things create, that you suddenly have new ways of painting, of punching out numerals, adding tracks, applying things to the dials, making different textures for subsidiary dials. So all of this is fueling something that is changing what we think of, what the nature of the wristwatch is, or of the watches.
In its form and its function, the watch is becoming more sophisticated, more desirable, and more useful, more practical at the same time.
Absolutely. And so connected to that, for instance, you've got the rise of the chronograph wristwatch during the 30s. So new things with tachometers, telemeters, pulsometers, so different professional uses.
And military uses have come into this as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, you might use your watch for range finding if you're in the artillery, or for navigation if you're in aeroplanes, or for timing car races in the new world of automobiles. But I think that there's more to the chronograph than that. These things they're modern, they're complex, precision instruments. And so they're appealing to a real sort of changing public perception. They're not just items of utility, they are becoming really interesting statements of technical advancement and accomplishment. They're specialist, but they're extraordinary. And of course, Patek goes heavily down the chronograph route at this time. The famous reference 130, wonderful chronograph introduced in 1936, and its bigger brother, the reference 530, which is a 36 millimeter chronograph, big sort of statement piece in those days.
I'm not sure I know the 530. I'm learning here.
Yeah, I mean, it looks very much like the 130 if you see it in a picture, but it's bigger.
Okay.
And Patek back then, of course. I mean, okay, here's a question for you: who is the biggest maker in history, or the most important maker of chronographs in watchmaking history? Would you say?
It feels like a trick question that I'm going to get caught out on. I feel like I'm going to try and get the right answer. I'm going to say Longines.
Yeah, okay. Well, yes, maybe, but...
No.
I'm going to suggest to you a company called Valjoux.
Oh, movement maker, sorry.
Well, there you go. You see, well, that's what it all comes down to now, because, of course, Patek ain't making these chronograph movements.
Gotcha.
It works, like everybody at this time, with suppliers and who are specialists in these things, and the movement specialist behind watches like the 130 and the 530 is a company called Valjoux, which of course now everybody will know for the movement known as the Valjoux 7750 and a few other movement names, but yeah, Valjoux, which of course is now a part of
Swatch Group.
Yeah, exactly. But back then, the very thought was a very, very prized supplier to top-tier brands like Patek Philippe. So that's on the one side, and then you've got the rise of perpetual calendars as well. So these are just beginning to creep through into wristwatches during this time.
Okay.
So obviously the earliest perpetual calendar we know as a wristwatch is Patek's very famous, very beautiful 97975, which actually was an adaptation of a movement made for a lady's pendant watch, I think in the late 19th century, that then found its way into a prototype wristwatch.
This is tiny as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very, very small. Yeah. And all the first examples, there was the famous Breguet one, I think it's known as the Dolphus.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a kind of tonneau shape. And people generally reckon that was maybe the first one, or certainly the first that we know of, where a perpetual calendar movement was made specifically for a wristwatch rather than adapted from something made either for a pocket watch or a pendant watch. Mm-hmm. So these things are beginning to happen. I think the Dolphus was in 1929. But when they appear, things like perpetual calendars and even minute repeaters, these are one-off creations. They're made to order effectively as commissions because they're so specialist, they're so delicate. And Patek will make these. Vacheron makes a few of these. I don't know if it makes perpetual calendars at this time. I don't think so. Maybe, but... Yeah. I mean, they're yes, repeaters, absolutely. The Schaefer watch, things like that. Mm. But there's very little. I mean, this is a tiny fringe part at the top tier. But Patek at this time is obviously going through huge changes of its own. So it had huge trouble as a result of the Wall Street crash. As Nicholas Fawkes records in his tome on the history of Patek Philippe, it was actually melting down gold cases to pay its workforce at one point.
That's remarkable.
It was so short on cash.
Yeah.
In 1932, what happens? Its dial maker effectively invests in order to save their biggest client, and this dial maker, Stern Frère, buys Patek Philippe, two brothers, Charles and Jean. Charles becomes chairman. Patek, at the same time as this is happening, and this was presumably already in the works, but it introduces reference 96, we mentioned earlier, what we described as nowadays the sort of the benchmark for the Calatrava, which reflects a much more modern style that things are going in. And there is a sense, looking back, and I'm sure this is in some ways applying the lens of history, but this comes in the same year that the Stern brothers take on Patek Philippe, that this is a kind of a rebirth, a move away towards something that is modern, hugely luxury, but really progressing into the future.
Well, I guess sometimes those coincidences are what you need to build momentum, even if it wasn't planned that way. That has given it the energy it needed.
Well, and they very clearly recognised that there was a need to be going in a much more capable direction in terms of what they could do themselves. So they appointed a chap called Jean Pfister, who became their head of technical development, hired him in from another watch company. And this was really about a drive towards being able to do much more in-house. Mm-hmm. So we have Patek on this trajectory that is moving forwards under new ownership into a new era. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that happens in 1937, the son of Charles Stern, Henri Stern, is named head of Patek Philippe Incorporated of America. Okay, he'll become president of Patek overall in the 1950s, but he goes to America in 37, and that is crucial.
Right.
Okay, he's really important because Patek's growth in the American market as we're coming out of the recession means it's opening up markets. And by having somebody directly there in what is the world's fastest growing economy at the time, Europe is still languishing, America's going great guns, and Patek have got a guy who's there on the ground, son of the owners,
right,
who's there to do business.
Okay. So Patek is on a new, profitable pathway, blasting away from the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. And its rising star is parachuted into the biggest growing watch market.
Yeah, stars are aligning.
Yeah. And as we'll hear after the break, it's the market where you're going to find the kinds of people who are rich enough and interested enough to be wowed by the idea of this grandiose pocket watch horology reworked in modern, exclusive, and absolutely cutting-edge wristwatch form. This episode of The Watch Inquiry is brought to you in partnership with Watch Insight, a new data-driven analytics platform for anyone working in the watch industry. As journalists, we're always looking for reliable sources of information that help us make sense of trends. Watch Insight pulls detailed product information from dozens of brands, giving us an incredibly useful overview of what's being launched. It's also a powerful tool for anyone in PR marketing, retail, the pre-owned market, or even after-sales care. You can track press and influencer coverage, monitor social sentiment, compare reviews with your competitors, and find out what's selling where and for how much. To find out more about what Watch Insight could do for your business, visit watchinsight.ch. Welcome back to the Watch Inquiry, where we're asking if 1941 and the launch of the first perpetual calendar wristwatches made in series was Patek Philippe's most important year. And Tim, before the break, we were hearing how Henri Stern, son of the family that now owns Patek Philippe, has arrived in America in 1937 with a mission to grow the most important market in the world, lay down roots that would feed and nourish its ambitions to make the world's most incredible watches.
Yeah, exactly. There was gold and greatness in them there hills, and Henri Stern, he was going to go panning for it. I mean, one thing I hadn't really realised is jewelers at this time, around America, they didn't necessarily want to be selling wristwatches. They were a kind of, a necessary evil. And, their specialist is jewellery and pocket watches in the past. These wristwatch things, these are gadgets. They're modern encumbrances of a different kind of world. So what Patek were being able to do was bridge that divide, was bridge the jewellery world, the delicate, high-value world, and we're talking, of course, top-tier jewellery, with this fast-changing world of wristwatches. And Henri Stern was travelling all over the country, working with these people, developing the market, developing the clientele.
As a side note, I suppose this was also a time when there really still was quite a flourishing American wristwatch industry.
Yes, that's true.
But not at the high end.
But not at the high end. No, exactly. Or very rarely at the high end. There is one interesting example that we'll come to a little bit later on.
Okay.
The other thing is that we're not just talking about North America. So some listeners may know about the Gondolo and Laborio project that Patek Philippe had in it was Mexico, wasn't it? Was
Uruguay?
it Brazil? Oh, Uruguay. Yeah, South America.
So.
Okay.
There's that famous picture of these 7 or 8 gentlemen in these wonderful hats.
Yeah, exactly. And where they had this program of people effectively being able to sort of join a club in order to own Patek Philippe watches.
Is this the collective horology of its day?
It was exactly wasn't it?
Yeah.
And Patek had these kind of tendrils running down into South America, which of course then there was quite a lot of wealthy individuals from the old world South America.
Yeah.
And actually that continued really into the mid-1950s, 1960s. And Alex Godby of Philips was telling me that some of the sort of the big, complicated 1940s, 1950s watches that have come to market over the past few years, it's from the South American market that some of these have come, where they've been ever since they were made back in those days.
Still emerging from original owner collections. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I think this outreach you've mentioned, this sort of mission to the US, establishing those relationships, obviously important, and it mirrored in modern day practices as well. No, this is
I think it's still how we think how Patek Philippe operates. In fact, their close ties with family jewelry businesses, with independent businesses, they've really stuck with that. They only have 3 of their own shops, or possibly 4 these days around the world. And why is that important to this story of something like the 1518? Well, he's going where the money is. And that means that you can make watches for where the money is in greater numbers and with greater ambition. And that ain't happening with any other brands at this time in the same way.
Well, this is what I'm moved to ask most obviously. It's easy to look in hindsight at sort of say how smart this was, but why wasn't anyone else doing this or able to do this?
They didn't have the resources or the capabilities. I mean, the Great Depression put a huge dent in the few brands that were able to operate in this market, and really you've got to go back to how Patek came out of the 19th century into the 20th century. It was the biggest, it was the best. And consider, let's say, so I mean, Breguet at that time, it's changed hands, it's not in the family anymore, it's barely existing, it's making a handful of watches, and as I understand it, it's mostly restoring old Breguet pieces.
Right.
AP, okay, that's family owned. It was down to about 5 employees at this point. They're making calendar watches in the 1920s and 30s, but not perpetuals.
Okay.
Yes, a handful of minute repeaters, but they were really, really small, very, very high end, but tiny. They were so different to what we think of as Audemars Piguet now that it's almost difficult to make the comparison. They're more like as an equivalent of, I don't know, Philippe Dufour or something like that. Just a very little studio doing beautiful things. Vacheron Constantin, they're in huge trouble at this time. They went through various management changes, ownership changes, and I think it was bought by the manager of Jaeger LeCoultre at the time. So it was kind of used as a vehicle for JLC movements, and they weren't making high complications.
Which had just about become Jaeger LeCoultre, as opposed to being LeCoultre and Jaeger was around.
Yeah, it's kind of blended, isn't it? Sometimes it's LeCoultre, sometimes it's Jaeger LeCoultre over that period.
The US market, LeCoultre remained the dial name in the US market for some time, which is why you see LeCoultre branded watches from after the dial name merger.
See, we're seeing why the US market is quite so important. You have to calibrate your brand to suit that market, because it's the market that really matters at this time. And it's something that at the top end Patek has got sewn up. So, around the world it's got the royalties, it's got the Maharajas, it's got the princes, and but it's got the new generation of industrial wealth.
Your Rockefellers and your JP Morgans.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
JP Morgan, a fella called Henry Graves.
Heard of him.
Yep. We might want to talk about. So I think it's an entire brand that is about preeminence and doing what others cannot and will not do. So it has the clients who can pay, it has the capabilities to reach them, and it now increasingly has the capabilities to make these things. But that doesn't mean to say that a perpetual calendar chronograph is what you'd necessarily expect to be at the top of anyone's shopping list. But there is, of course, a watch we haven't mentioned, which is the Graves Super Complication, made for Henry Graves Jr., the most complicated timepiece ever made without the assistance of computers. And until the late 20th century, it was the most complicated timepiece ever made. 24 functions, a massive kind of cricket ball of a watch. And the Graves was made, I think it was started in the mid-20s and completed in 1933. And this is where we maybe take a little sideline into the other brand. We've talked a little bit about Valjoux, but the other company that's crucial here, which is Victorin Piguet.
Right, because we talked about how Patek did come to bring some technical expertise in-house, but we've jumped back a bit again now, and this is very much it's a key part of the story. Yeah,
Victorin Piguet is a name that now you hear it in connection with early Patek complicated watches. It's faded away because actually eventually I think in the kind of 20th century it was pretty much subsumed into Patek Philippe. I think, as I understand it, by about 1980 it was effectively a sort of small workshop subsidiary creating grand complications for Patek and eventually just sort of faded into Patek. But it was actually a company that was as old as Patek Philippe. It goes right back.
Okay.
They had been working alongside each other from the beginning. So 1839 is when Patek Philippe comes into being, and Victorin Piguet, who the company is named after, is actually his father, Daniel Henri Piguet, starts supplying Patek with minute repeater movements right from the get-go. So I think their earliest known collaboration is in 1841. And during the 19th century, they're doing incredible work, kind of miniaturizing minute repeater earbushes to fit into delicate pendant watches that are becoming very fashionable for extremely rich ladies of the time.
So the groundwork was already being laid, whether they knew it or not, for making high complication wristwatches.
Absolutely. I mean, and you see that with the 97975, that first perpetual calendar wristwatch that we know of. That was, of course, taken from one of these movements made for a pendant watch.
Yeah.
So Victorin Piguet becomes key supplier for Patek's complicated movement through the first part of the 20th century. Chronographs, split-second chronographs, perpetual calendars. And it's a really fascinating relationship, really, because there's a sort of synergistic sense of discovery, I think, and particularly as you get into something like the Super Complication, these two companies are completely dependent upon each other.
Right.
Patek dependent upon the expertise of Victorin Piguet. Victorin Piguet dependent upon the clout and reach and patronage of Patek Philippe. Yeah. So they grow together, and what you have by the end of the 1930s is this expertise in chronographs with Valjoux by that time, expertise in calendars and high complications with Victorin Piguet, the Super Complication and various other things that are the workshops for this new wrist-bound watchmaking. And inside Patek, there's growing expertise in assembly and design and skills, and the clientele who have the money and desire to stick with Patek Philippe and keep going upwards with it. And it's worth noting, by the way, that when the 1518 came, it was Henry Graves was one of the people who bought it.
But of course,
so
got to have one of those.
He's got the mega pocket watch version, so you've got to have the wristwatch as well. The super complication, of course, is the most famous example, but there is another watch that's really worth talking about here, which I had never heard of and really wasn't aware of. And this is the Schultz Grand Complication.
Okay.
Do you know about James Schultz?
I can't say that I do. Tell me.
Well, this is why when we mentioned American watchmaking not being very high-end, okay, this is the exception to the rule.
Right.
So in 1930, James Schultz, an American watchmaker, comes out with a watch that contains a perpetual calendar, a chronograph, and a minute repeater.
Ah.
And it's completely unique, and I think it remains the most complicated wristwatch up until the 80s or 90s. And this was actually made by Victor and Piguet.
Okay.
So Schultz is an American watchmaker who made kind of private white label watches for high-end clients. He had a shop in New York, collaborated with brands like Tiffany and Cartier, and he used to get minute repeaters, calendar watches, perpetual calendars that, okay, those weren't yet common in wristwatches, but this is the world he was moving in.
Right.
And he would get the Swiss companies would make the ébauches for these watches, but Schultz was the watchmaker who was then assembling these and designing them and creating this. And he wanted to create the world's most complicated wristwatch, which is quite interesting because to sort of even think that was a concept in 1929, 1930. Okay,
Sure.
You've got the super complication and things like that, and this kind of, you've had a war between JP Morgan and Henry Graves over who can have the most complicated pocket watches. But the idea of a sort of super complication wristwatch is a very eccentric idea at this point, and Schultz clearly was a very eccentric man. But I'm just fascinated by this. And so it was a kind of a tonneau-shaped watch with a perpetual calendar, single-button chronograph, and minute repeater. And Schultz, in fact, he never even intended to sell the watch. It was for him to sort of do advertising and promotions.
It was a statement piece for him, right?
It was this is who I am. He actually did sell it in the mid 1940s, which is, maybe at that point Patek's come to market with its perpetual calendar chronograph, and suddenly this kind of combination is seen as desirable. So he sold it to I think an American tycoon, but it's in a private collection, I understand, from Alex Gottby. It's in Europe somewhere.
So Schultz made this, invested a huge amount of money in it, presumably.
Yeah, 11,000 Swiss francs it cost him. So if you remember,
right,
the
3,000 salary.
Yeah, so
he did that and sat on it for a decade and a half.
Sat on it, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It was an unbelievably complicated watch. But what I think is interesting about this is that's in 1930. Victor and Piguet makes that for him.
Okay.
So they must have done development and research in how to put these pieces together, how to assemble, how to create that movement.
Combining these complications
at the same time as they're doing the super complication with Patek and lots of other things.
Okay.
Minute repeaters and split seconds, chronographs and things. But I mean, this sense of intense miniaturization of the most complicated watchmaking as a sport in and of itself is now really emerging. And it's really interesting to imagine what kind of an influence Schultz and his crazy watch might have had on that.
Okay, and then Hitler invades Poland. The world is thrown into turmoil and war. What does that do to our story?
Well, after the break, we will find out.
Support for the Watch Inquiry comes from Richard Anderson, a legend in English tailoring whose new store, Riches, is the last word in ready-to-wear elegance and style. If you value the craft and beauty of a fine wristwatch, you'll like the same qualities in a handmade garment too, which is what Richard has been creating on London's Savile Row for over 40 years. Now, the king of bespoke has brought that same mastery to ready-to-wear. At Richard's, you'll find Japanese denim, moleskin trousers, Scottish knitwear, raincoats, and some fabulously natty silk dressing gowns that I've personally got my eye on, and plenty else besides. It's all cut from Richard's own patterns, made in small runs and built to last. It's English craft without the compromise and without the weight. Explore the full collection at richardandersonlimited.com, or even better, visit Richard's in person at number 13 Savile Row.
So before the break, we were hearing about Victor and Piguet, which was the Renault and Papi of its day, and the key horological force behind Patek Philippe's most complicated watches. But then, just as Henri Stern and co are ready to reap the rewards, Europe is plunged into the Second World War. So what does that mean for the viability of these super watches that presumably Patek Philippe had in the planning for production in series, rather than as one-offs?
Okay, so the interesting thing is nothing, I don't think.
Okay.
Because Patek, obviously Switzerland stays neutral. The war has a huge shock impact on the Swiss watch industry, and from the kind of massive highs of the sales by volume of the late 30s, by 44 we're down to 12 million watches in export, and a big proportion of those are going to be military watches.
Right.
Obviously, through its neutrality, Switzerland is working with all comers on all sides, as we know. But, of course, Patek, which ain't really in the business of supplying military watches, but it has the reach and the clientele to basically act as though the war isn't happening and put these complications into production. So they see that this market is wanting something, a statement, a wrist-borne statement piece that descends from the kind of eminence that you get in these super complication pocket watches, that combines complicated elements. But it's one thing to make a one-off or a Maharaja here and a Duke there.
Okay.
The point is that this new world that they're reaching into gives you much more capability, and these are going into series production. And that's what's really different and important about this. And okay, they're not making these in huge numbers. 230 odd over a number of years is no great number of watches. But on the other hand, for something like this,
By
in those
today's
days,
standards, but it's a quantum leap forward from what had gone before, right?
Absolutely right.
I mean, is it too trite to say that Patek Philippe was able to make these incredible watches because that's what it's always done? That's been its absolute raison d'etre. Is that?
I don't think it is too trite. It's trite, I suppose, to reduce it down to that being the explanation of itself. But I think that underlying that, there is this extraordinary story that leads us to this point, and that makes something that in some ways seems illogical become a logical reality out of this period of galvanistic development and turmoil. So maybe you could say that is 1941 the most important year in Patek Philippe history? Well, no, you'd probably say it's 1932. But on the other hand, 1941 is the year when somehow all of this comes together, and they don't just step into the big league, they create an entirely new league, and they're the only ones in it for a very long time.
For decades, right?
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah. I mean, AP began making perpetuals in the 1950s. The beautiful 55-16, that sort of ultra slim, beautiful look. But, it's not till the 70s that this is really becoming much more of a thing. They're in tiny numbers. One interesting point, I think, perhaps to finish on, is Universal Genève. Because this is now, there's an interesting moment coming, because Universal Genève, a much beloved brand that is kind of no longer with us, but is going to be with us again, because its rights have been bought up by Breitling.
Yeah.
So we're awaiting the return of Universal. But in those days, Universal, big specialist in chronographs, in quite complicated watches, but not at this level. But they did have this watch, the Tricompax, which mixes the chronograph with a triple calendar, and is in some ways, I think, like the kind of approachable son of the 1518. Launches in 1944, I think. Triple calendar chronograph, and 3 years after the 1518, you have a watch that is offering, in some ways, the same thing in terms of the style.
The look and feel.
The look and feel is now cemented, but at a different price level. And what's really interesting is that Henri Stern, who by this time is the sole distributor of Patek Philippe in America, also had the importing license on Universal Genève. So he's able to sell these watches side by side effectively. And so that sense that the die is cast in a new language of complicated watches, and in this merging of a kind of utilitarian function with something that's classical and that reaches into the idea of posterity and beauty, is from this moment now becoming cemented into a watch and our conceptions of what a watch can be. So it's not just in the evolution of perpetual calendars or perpetual calendar chronographs that the 1518 is so essential, but it reaches much more broadly into what we think a prestige, beautiful, classical, but also sporty watch can really be in the modern age.
Well, on that basis, I think I've loved hearing you sort of talk me through this, by the way. It's been fascinating. On that basis, I think I would answer our question with the answer, yes, it does sound like 41 was potentially the pivotal year for Patek Philippe. I also think you may have just teed up a Series 2 episode on Universal Genève. But
exactly. Let's put a pin in that and see where they go.
And it makes me want to ask, actually, do you have a favourite Patek Philippe perpetual calendar?
Okay, yes. One I particularly love is the 3940.
Okay.
Which is the very classic, understated, slimline perpetual that came out in the 1980s. It's the kind of the return of complicated watchmaking in a very understated way. It's the echt perpetual calendar of the Philippe Stern era. I'm also, from the current collection, I've become quite taken with a watch I didn't think I liked originally at first, which is the 5320, the rather sporty one with the syringe hands.
Oh yeah,
and the sort of luminous applied numerals.
Is this a salmon dial?
Yeah, now in salmon dial version. Although I remember seeing Patrick Gertrude, who the guy behind the Oak collection. He had a black dial version of the 5320, which looked absolutely sensational.
I like
must say. So maybe I'd dream of getting hold of that.
Okay.
And what about you?
I think if it was a pure perpetual calendar, I'm really drawn to the 3448 because it's so sparse, so reduced. Obviously, it was the successor to the 1526 that you brought us in on. And I like this idea of a perpetual calendar, and other brands have done this, but a perpetual calendar being able to do everything that does, but not necessarily having to show everything that does.
Yeah.
You have everything you need.
In a way, that's what's so lovely about the 1526.
Yeah.
It's unlike the 1518, which kind of for the time shouts from the rooftops about just everything that's going on inside it and what an achievement. The 1526 does have this real sense of classicism and beauty, and I agree that's very much kind of carried through into the 3448. I
think though, if on the subject of shouting from the rooftops, if you're gonna talk about perpetual calendar chronographs for this long, I want to mention the 5004 as well. And that's the split second perpetual calendar chronograph. Ultimate. Take things another level again. I love split second chronographs anyway.
Yeah.
And there's a reference, a platinum reference, 5004P with a black dial dial made towards the end of the 90s,
Right.
I believe. And these are sort of big money, super collector watches these days. But that is just, for me, so nice. With Arabic numerals, black dial, split seconds chrono, 36mm case, just fantastic.
Yeah, very, very special. Again, that's also from that kind of the period of, in a sense, returning to the past glories and then surpassing them, isn't it? You know, it's that moment of preeminence returns. Not that it had ever gone away, but just building up and up and up and leaving everybody in its wake.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'll say again, thank you so much for taking me through this history.
Cool.
Thank you all for listening.
Yeah,
Thanks.
cheers, everybody.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you back for the next episode.
Yep, let us know your thoughts. Yes, see you again soon.